Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to be able to address the Senate as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I joined our colleagues today at lunch, and one of the conversations that I had with one of my Democrat colleagues was how surprising, perhaps, but certainly how pleasing it was that today the Senate, in a bipartisan fashion, addressed some contentious issues. Issues related to sanctions in regard to Iran, issues related to sanctions in regard to Russia. Both of those issues, because of the political climate and because of past history, could be fraught with great opportunity for partisanship to be exhibited in full force. And the conversation I had with my colleague was how surprising and, more importantly, how pleasing it was that that didn't happen. And so I want to commend the Senate and its leadership for working together to resolve and create this opportunity, resolve the potential differences and create this opportunity for us to have a debate, discussion, and vote on public policy that I think is important to the security of the world and the safety of Americans here in the United States. And I'm here in part to express my support for the Countering Iran Destabilizing Activities Act, the legislation that we addressed today. It permits our government to target those individuals and institutions responsible for a foreign policy that puts American lives at risk and undermines the security, particularly of the Middle East, but really of the globe. The theocratic, autocratic regime's survival in Iran depends currently on the human rights abuses and political oppression. 8 years after the Green Movement's protests, the group's leaders remain under house arrest. Members of that movement were tortured, and still today, Iranian Americans are unreasonably detained without hope for release in Iran. The Iranian regime's survival depends further on its control of its economy. When it was brokered, proponents of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action argued it would provide economic benefit to the Iranian people. So when President Obama negotiated and this Congress, this Senate, failed to reject the JCPA, one of the arguments about its benefits is that everyday Iranians would enjoy greater economic opportunity. Instead, a recent Reuters study shows that businesses directly tied to the Supreme Leader and to the IRGC are the main beneficiaries of those changes in our relationship with Iran. Despite renewed economic growth, Iran's unemployment rate is estimated to be as high as 12%, and that figure could be as high as almost 30% among Iranian youth. Survival of Khamenei's regime depends on stoking hatred of America as a way to whip up support. Iran uses small boats to swarm American Navy ships, protecting the free navigation of the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. This is disturbing for a number of reasons, but given the importance of that strait's role in global economy, certainly is one of them. In addition, it's linked to scouting soft American targets for terrorism. So we continue to see bad behavior, threatening behavior, by the Iranian government toward the United States and our interest and global interest in the Straits of Hormuz, and the suggestion that Iran is preparing, looking for opportunities for terrorist attacks against the United States and its allies in the Middle East. Last week, 2 Hezbollah operatives were arrested here in the United States. They were doing surveillance on targets in New York and on our embassies as well in Israel and Panama. 2 terrorism specialists, Dan Byman of Georgetown and Scott Stewart of Stratford, tweeted in reaction to this news that this could be a case of Iran sending us an ominous message that Iran can play the terror card if it wants to. If that is indeed the signal that Tehran is sending to us, it is important, it's imperative, in fact, that we send a message of our own, that no civilized country resorts to planning to kill innocent civilians. The legislation that we passed today informs that regime that the JCPOA does not provide impunity for Iran to make such plans. Iran threatens its neighbors with its ongoing ballistic missile development, which was not a part of the JCPOA. Hezbollah is armed with tens of thousands of rockets threatening Israel's security. This is the same group which has been instrumental in propping up the Assad regime in Syria and which is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands. The head of the IRGC forces was seen on Syria-Iraq border just this past weekend. We know that Assad's regime would have not survived without Iran's continued financial and military support. Again, this legislation underscores the Senate's belief that the Iranian regime must not be allowed to continue conducting and destabilizing activities under the shield of the JCPOA. I was an opponent to the JCPOA, but today's actions are unrelated to undermining that agreement, which is now in place. They are designed to hold back further activities by the Iranian regime against America and its interests. It's really a requirement that Iran act within the nation state's code of conduct, the normal behavior of a country around the globe. Previous administrations, in my view, failed to challenge Iran on way too many fronts. And with this legislation, the Senate is intent on pushing back on Iran's adventurism in the Middle East and beyond. By imposing appropriate sanctions and requiring the Secretaries of State, Defense, and Treasury, as well as the Director of National Intelligence, to formulate a coherent strategy to counter Iran's influence in the region, we say to the regime that their activities will be countered every step of the way. This legislation plays a part in doing what Dan Byman, the professor, the terrorism expert, testified to our House counterparts last month. And his words were to highlight the costs of Iran's adventurism to ordinary Iranians, to raise domestic awareness of and discontent with the regime's foreign policy. There remains more that can be done to challenge Iran and constrict its resources. Many amendments were filed to strengthen this legislation that were not ultimately considered. One of those was mine. Last year, the Obama administration announced that it would pay $1.7 billion to Iran in an effort to settle a long-standing financial dispute. Transferring cash to a leading state sponsor of terror was a bad idea when the Senate considered the 2015 nuclear agreement, and it remains a bad idea, a terrible idea today. The amendment I offered to today's legislation would limit the President's ability to transfer funds to Iran. This amendment directs that the U.S. government to put justice for American victims of Iranian terrorism ahead of the payments to the Iranian regime. No administration should transfer funds related to Iran-United States Claims Tribunal without first requiring settlements of all damages already awarded in judgments made in the U.S. courts against Iran for their terrorism crimes against our own citizens. Pay our own citizens from that fund before any money should be transferred to the Iranian regime. Makes sense, common sense, and it's surrounded by the sense of justice and right. While my amendment was not one of those considered by the Senate yet, we'll be introducing this concept as in freestanding legislation in the near future. I know that sanctions alone will not change Iran's regime's behavior. Incidentally, we need our allies and friends to join us in this sanction effort. Yet we know countering Iran's Destabilizing Activities Act remains an important bill to impose costs on the regime in Iran and hopefully encourage more of the discontent we saw during the recent elections. Perhaps there will rise an equivalent to the 2009 Green Movement that offers Iranians one more opportunity to throw off the yoke of theocratic rule, of tyranny, and get the government they deserve, one that respects their rights and has the desire to coexist peacefully with its neighbors. Mr. President, I yield the floor.